Now, the question is, when Luther started everything, he was so righteous. How in the world did he dislike the Jews? And from what I read, some of his writing has been picked up by Hitler, and he made a Holocaust out of it. That's my question.
Yeah. Well, in the 16th century, Luther was not unusual for disliking the Jews. He wrote several works about the Jews, and the unusual one was the one he wrote when he was younger, that Jesus Christ was a Jew, where he wrote that the Jews ought to be treated better by the Christians than they had been, that the Christians ought to have respect for the Jews for the sake of Jesus Christ and the apostles who were Jews. The early Christians were Jews, and made the case basically, how do you expect them to ever see the light and come to the fullness of their own ancient faith in Jesus Christ if you're always closing them out of the conversation and looking down your nose at them and spreading rumors about them and being nasty to them. And that was when he was unusual. He became more a product of his own civilization later on in his life, as in his experience, the Jews did not, in fact, turn to Christianity, and some of his attitudes that were cultural attitudes hardened. There was nothing like modern toleration in the 16th century. The fact that Luther could write what he did about how heretics shouldn't be killed and it be something that people would be surprised by helps communicate this to you. Christendom, Western Europe, was this society where everybody was Christian except one group of people. The Jews were the only people in Europe. It's like if there happened to be Jews living in your town, that's the only way you would ever see somebody who wasn't a Christian, at least culturally and in terms of what they technically believed, whether they acted like it or not. That was the only way you would ever see somebody who wasn't a Christian. And if there wasn't a Jew around, you would never see somebody who wasn't a Christian. And so they were this religious minority, and the generality of the people just couldn't understand, how can you be against God? How can you be against Jesus? How can you be against all that is good and true and right? And so it was not anti-Semitism in the modern sense. Anti-Semitism is a technical modern term which is connected with genetic theories, evolutionary theories, that there's something genetically wrong with the Jews, so that even if a Jew were to become a Christian, the Nazis would still go after him because they didn't care what the guy believed, they cared what he was. And that's anti-Semitism. The closest that Christian anti-Judaism ever came to that was when people would say, well, I can't believe the Jews still don't believe in Christ after all these hundreds of years. There must be something wrong with them. When they would talk like that, that's the closest that it came to what we know as modern anti-Semitism. And even then, it wasn't the same thing, because if any Jew did believe in Christ, then he wasn't a Jew anymore. He was a Christian. And so that was a different way of looking at it. So for Luther to be unfriendly to the Jews, antagonistic to the Jews, was just what was expected in the 16th century. That doesn't surprise anybody. And when he wrote that book on the Jews and their lies, he was countering Jewish objections to Christianity that had come to his attention. And so that's the lies that he talks about in the title. And so he goes through these Jewish objections to Christianity, which are, in some cases, scandalous things about Jesus Christ and make him very angry. And so he treats it with the same violent language he treats everything. And in my mind, the really problematic thing about the treatise, The Jews and Their Lies, is when he gets to the part where he makes recommendations to the princes, to the civil government about what they should do about these people who live amongst the Christians and have such, and despise the Christians so much and despise the truth and are so wrong-headed. What should you do about them? And he comes up with recommendations like that you should close their synagogues and you should take away their books. We talked about the importance of the books, the freedom of conscience, and you should close their schools, and you should maybe exile them. Don't let them continue to sit on the lap of Christendom and mock Christ at the same time. And that is really the harmful stuff there. And that is the stuff that most of the theologians had held off in doing. There's a very interesting section in Thomas Aquinas, Summa Theologica, where he tackles the question. It's like, should we take the children of the Jews away from them so that they can be converted to the true faith? And he says no, because that would be a terrible violation of natural rights. It would be a terrible violation of their rights as parents that God has given them. And that's one of the reasons he gives. He gives other reasons too, like it's apparently God's will that there should still be Jews so that we can learn by direct comparison the difference between accepting Christ and rejecting Christ and things like that. He had other reasons too. But he says, no, you shouldn't treat them that way. And mostly it had been, kings and rulers who had treated them that way. I thought this question might come up, so I have one extra slide here. This is a map of the various expulsions of the Jews from various countries and cities in Europe from 1100 to 1600. You see one of the biggest ones was in Spain in 1492, the same year that Columbus sailed the ocean blue. All the Jews in Spain were given an ultimatum to convert to Christianity or get out of the country. And they were kicked out of England in 1290. They were kicked out of France a bunch of times. And scholars who have gone back and looked at this have been able to correlate sometimes when they get kicked out with when the king owes them a lot of money. They end up as the moneylenders of Europe because for most of the Middle Ages, Christians are not allowed to charge interest to each other. So the Jews end up as the only ones who can make money as bankers. And so sometimes governments borrow a lot of money from them, and then they can't pay it back. And they're like, why are we paying money to these Jews anyway? Let's just kick them out of the country. So this is the world that Luther lived in. It had happened a lot before his time, and it happened after his time. And I don't think it was that much of a shock to people in his own day when he wrote it. But it's something that every Lutheran alive today wishes he hadn't written, I guess except for a few who are actually anti-Semitic. We wish he hadn't written it. And the fact that the Nazis made use of it, basically it just proved they were bound to make use of it because Luther is such a national hero in Germany. And they were fascists. I mean, they're all about German culture. And Luther is this cultural hero, and he said these things that they can marshal in their own crusade against the Jews. And so that's why they quoted him. But if Luther had restrained himself a little bit, he would have deprived them of some propaganda.